In Turkey, President Erdogan called parliamentary and presidential elections for June 24th, more than a year earlier than they were due to take place. Why the rush? Although Erdogan's chances of winning the presidency seem good, the result is uncertain due to strong opposition. And according to the polls, people assume the vote will likely go to a runoff. What are the real challenges to Erdogan? Turkey has changed its system from a parliamentary democracy to a powerful executive presidency and will hand the president sweeping new powers after the elections. What can we expect from this transformation? The US has just delivered 2 F-35 fighter jets to Turkey, with more meant to be on the way. But on June 21st, the Turkish government declared tariffs on US goods worth more than $266 million as retaliation to Washington's extra steel tariffs. What role will the US play in the Turkish elections?
Turkey is holding presidential and parliamentary elections on Sunday ahead of schedule. President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan called them 18 months early to overcome what he termed as uncertainty in a troubled time. He is expected to solidify his position as the most powerful leader in recent Turkish history, following the outcome of the constitutional referendum last year. So what challenges does Mr. Erdogan face from the opposition this time? How will the newly elected president deal with the country's economic plight? What will be Turkey's political and diplomatic strategies for the next few years? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Ms. He Wenping, Senior Research Fellow at the Chahar Institute, and Mr. Einar Tangen, author and columnist. By satellite, we'll also speak to Serkan Aral, who is a political analyst and writer based in Istanbul, and Mr. Maya Javandamva, a Middle East analyst based in Tel Aviv. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pandong. So, guests, this time's election in Turkey was described by President Erdogan as uncertainty in a troubled time. Therefore, it's much more earlier than it's scheduled. What do you think he meant by uncertainty in a troubled time, Ms. He?
Well, we all know last year after this constitutional referendum, and Erdogan wants to change the political system in Turkey from a parliamentary system to the presidential system. So in his eyes, there is a parliamentary system, even though now he has been already elected president for the first time, he thinks it's still becoming like some kind of blockade for his policy proceeding. So in his mind, this uncertainty means if he cannot continue his presidency and the second term, and also consolidate this system, presidential system, and then a lot of issues like foreign policy, like how to attract the foreign investment in Turkey, because Turkey right now is facing this economic, the inflation, and also the currency now is down and downside. So all of this diplomacy and also domestic power consolidation, all of that, he mentioned this is uncertainty. Even his action, like anti-terror, his military action in Syria, so he couldn't guarantee all those policies he has been done can be continued. So that's the thing he mentioned, uncertain, but he wants to make this becoming very sure, very certain, with another term has been inked.
So Mr. Erdogan believes that the centralization of power is the way out for this uncertainty. Is that the case?
Yes, I think so. I mean, he's the latest in a line of strong men. I mean, the Turks like somebody who's very strong. It was the Ottoman Empire, remember, and things like that. The way I've divided up is, and I agree with my associate, that what you have are some countrywide politics, the internal things. It has been growing at 7.4%, which put it in the top tier of economic growth in 2017. Then you talk about regional issues, and obviously, there are issues with Syria. There are also issues with not the insurgents, but the group that wants to be independent, and then there's this leadership within the Muslim world where he wants to position himself, and that puts him kind of at odds with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then geopolitically, he has issues with the U.S. over the F-35 fighter jets. He has issues with Russia because he wants to buy their S-400 missile system. And he's been moving slowly away from the EU. And in the absence of that, I think he's been moving closer to Russia and China. So if you start looking at the broader picture, the political sands are shifting, and he's trying to be a free agent. He's trying to mix and match and get the best deal he can and still leave room to maneuver domestically.
So no matter who wins the person, we're going to have an executive presidency, and at the core of this executive presidency is the power to issue presidential decree. That means making law unilaterally. How much is this shake-up or overhaul to a modern Turkish politics, Ms. He?
Well, we have seen very clearly since Erdogan is in power, especially after this last year constitutional referendum. Now he wants to, grasp for more power in his own hand, and he also saying in his idea, because now the international situation is such, a very complicated situation. A lot of big powers policy is also uncertainty. We all see that the United States, under the President Trump's leadership, also a lot of policy is quite uncertainty. So we think this kind of situation for the Turkey, if this country wants to continue to show its leadership role, and not only in the Middle East and also stands out in the international stage, they definitely need a strong man. So he regarded himself as the strong man. Now it's very suitable to lead this country continually forward in this historical, this juncture time. So I think, of course, after this election, he will further consolidate his power, and also will weaken those power coming from the parliament side. So which means no matter how many parties now in the parliament, and you will not cause a very serious those check and balance those functions anymore.
So would there be a scenario like a person wins the presidency, but his party, his or her party, lost majority in the parliament? How will this strongmanship play out in this case scenario?
Before this constitutional referendum, Turkey is a system called the parliament system. So which means if different party you have after the election results, you have controlled different percentage of the seats in the parliament, which gives you a lot of saying power, even for those resolution passed, and then if you veto them, maybe cannot becoming a law. But after this, the constitutional referendum, now a lot of power now moving in the hands of the president. Even the president can name the deputy president and name all those ministers in his cabinet. So that power from the parliament has been weakened. So you cannot say no to a lot of decisions has been made by the presidential himself, and all those cabinet, those ministers has been appointed by the president. So which means no matter how many, even though he's like AKP, his own party, even get less seats in the parliament, that because the general power coming from the parliament now has been weakening. So that means naturally, even though the seats becoming less from the ruling party, so that will not cause a major obstacle for his policy or for his decision has been proceeded forward.
And let's remember that Turkey is still in a state of emergency after last year's failed coup against Mr. Erdogan. How much will that impact this time's balloting, Mr. Tanga?
Well, that is yet to be seen. He appealed to a lot of people by basically desecularizing the government, allowing women to wear headscarves, which they weren't allowed to do in public before, and he has a very strong support among that group. But I don't think that the majority of people supporting him, what they like about him is he's decisive. They're tired of governments where there was a lot of finger-pointing and blaming, but nothing got done. He has a very grandiose vision. The question is, will he be able to carry out? The economic news probably for this year will not be as good as last year. And they're bracing for that, and not only because of the international situation, but because a lot of it was because of fiscal policy and monetary policy, where they were pushing money into the system, and that's why they had that very high growth rate. So in terms of how it comes out, we'll have to see. I was referring to the Kurds earlier.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now let's talk to Mr. Serkan Oral in Istanbul. He is a political analyst and a writer. Mr. Oral, let's talk more about the Turkish economy. For years, the AKP has made economy as one of its major achievements. But now, do you think Turkey is really in an economic plight?
Thank you. These elections will be a turning point for Turkish modern history, and the main point is security and the economy. In these days, the interest rates are down, the inflation and the current account deficit, the 18% of unemployment, the young voters are not enjoying with this. So the main decision will be with the economic struggles and the security problems, and the elections, after the elections, who will be elected, it doesn't matter. Turkey is still waiting complicated economic problems, also carrying from years and years. Also, the opposition leaders are strategically saying and against Erdogan on this topic. On the economic way, they don't seem Erdogan successful, but Erdogan says after the elections there will be new system, and he will especially focus on economic issues.
So, talking about security, let's talk about this candidate, Selahattin Demirtas. He's running for the pro-Kurdish party HDP while still in prison. How much impact can he bring to this political campaign?
Let's see the point. He was candidated when he was in prison already. I mean, his party can show another candidate, but they didn't do this. But after all, if they passes the 10% of the votes, then they will be at the parliament. So the HDP party will be a key role, playing a key role on the parliament side elections. If they are not at the parliamentary and down 10%, then Erdogan and Nationalist Alliance will get the majority of the parliament. So a powerful president and a powerful parliament will be on the picture.
Last but not least, let's talk about this female candidate, Meral Akşener from the Good Party. He's also against the AKP's economic policies. Tell us more about that, and do you think she's also important for the women empowerment in Turkey?
What did Erdogan do at the last 16 years? This unique elections, he united the opposition parties. That is important. The five opposition leaders united against Erdogan. One of them is, as you mentioned, a lady leader, and she is nationalist based, and she's supported by the youngers in Turkey, and as the other Islamist nationalists and the Turkish Kurdish companies and secularists, they are coming together against Erdogan. So she is a flag of showing the change in Turkey, but the ground polls are showing that the main opposition leader, İnce, is getting more votes than her. So it seems that Erdogan and the main opposition leader, İnce, are racing together now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Serkan Aral, a political analyst and writer based in Istanbul. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. So, Ms. He, what's the biggest challenge in geopolitics for Turkey now?
Well, I think Turkey now is facing a very difficult diplomatic choice. Before that military coup, actually Erdogan is trying to be one member of the EU. He wants to have a good relation with the United States, and even Turkey has a very difficult time with Russia. But after that military coup, and then suddenly Turkey has made a U-turn with its diplomatic ties, closer with Russia, and also together with Iran to move forward this Syria diplomatic process, negotiation process. And then he finger-pointing to the United States is behind that military coup. So make distance. And plus this, this referendum of constitution make power more in his own hand. So this make a further distance away from the EU. So EU side also criticize this domestic move made by the Erdogan, like for example arrested a lot of people, like put them in jail. So this is against those standards of those human rights. So that make this dream, that dream has been long pursuing from all those kinds of leadership of Turkey, that is becoming a member of the EU. But now this dream, I think, is no longer to be very realistic. So because it is further away from those pursuing. So that makes the Turkey now want to switch its focus, no longer focus on the EU. Now it's a switch to the eastern, eastern part. For example, they saying want to be part of One Belt, One Road of China's this initiative. They also now are tied very closely with Russia, trying to use this power from Russia to support its status becoming still a very influential power in the Middle East area. After that Arab Spring that took place in the year 2011, and then for some shortened time, Turkey even has been regarded widely by those Arab Spring experienced countries as a model for their future. For those countries how to develop the future. So Turkey should be a model because this country combining these religions and this modern democracy closely in a very perfect way, and also enjoy the very good economic growth rate. So for those countries, they are in transition period. They are still trying to explore what kind of development model is suitable for them. So Turkey has been regarded as a model to be followed. But that kind of shining image at that juncture nowadays seems no longer shining as before. So this is also a challenge for Turkey.
And the whole world is changing. The United States is pulling out so many world institutions. And Mr. Tangen, do you think there will be more repercussions from this widening gap between Turkey and the West, especially the EU?
Well, I'm going to agree with her being on this one. What you do is you see a shift, but it's not just a personal shift. There seems to be this idea, for instance, just a few days ago, you had the leader of North Korea coming to China because he sees this as a non-interference country. There's no, they bring trade, but they don't bring any judgment. And this is very appealing, especially for somebody like Erdogan, who's constantly being criticized by the U.S. and by the EU. He still feels the U.S. was somehow behind the attempted coup because they continue to allow Gulen to remain in the U.S. Despite his pleas to have him returned. So you see this kind of political separation between strongmen, politics, and politicians who seem to be siding more with the East. And it's not just those organizations. They're also looking at the SCO, which would be a major issue because of NATO and their involvement in it, the largest standing army within NATO. So it really is, once again, this kind of cusp. It's the area that has always been the connection point between East and West, and the way it falls is a real harbinger of things to come.
Talking about connection point, what about Syria? Some are saying that it's now the focal point of a geopolitical power wrangling, and this also relates to Turkey's own security problem, for example, the Kurdish issue. What do you make of the panning out of the Syria crisis after this time's Turkish election?
Well, quite frankly, it reminds me of the partition of Poland. I mean, what you have in reality is these forces who are intent on holding some sort of domination over Syria. Russians obviously want to keep their bases intact, which have been expanded. You have Iran, who is using it as part of their proxy for power in the area. You have Syria, who's pushing back. Saudi Arabians are involved. And of course, our friends, the Kurds, also have a stake in this. So you have a very, very mixed area. Each many powers vying to be number one. But the problem with that is this will continue. It cannot be solved at the conference table, no matter how much people want to believe that. It's very difficult to know how that can come to some resolution until people literally get sick and tired of fighting and killing.
Right. For more on that, let's cross live to Maya Javandanva, a Middle East analyst based in Tel Aviv. Mr. Javandanva, let's talk more about the Syria issue. So, do you think it will get ever more complicated after Turkey's election this time?
Well, that really depends if we have a stable government. I mean, let's just say it's a viable scenario that President Erdogan wins the presidency, but he loses the parliament, let's just say, or he does badly in the parliament. According to the amendments made in the referendum, after the referendum last year, according to his executive powers, he can basically dissolve the parliament, which would mean another set of elections, which would mean another uncertainty. So first and foremost, we have to see if we're going to see a stable government. These elections themselves will not be sufficient. We'll have to presidential elections will not be sufficient. We'll have to see what the future parliament will look like. We'll have to see what the coalitions in the future parliament will look like. But, you know, in terms of Syria, it really depends how the opposition does. We have to remember, you know, one of the key issues on these elections is also the refugee issue in Syria, in Turkey. Turkey is hosting 4 million Syrian refugees. That's 5% of the entire population of Turkey. This is one of the biggest, Turkey right now is one of the biggest refugee camps in the world. So it's a really key question what will happen. If Mr. Ince of the Republican People's Party, the opposition, wins, he has said that he's going to recognize the Bashar al-Assad government, he's going to open up embassy with the Syrians, and he's going to negotiate with them. But if Mr. Erdogan wins, I think we're going to see more of the same issue, more of the same approach, which means that Turkey is going to work with Russia, but at the same time it's going to try to undermine President Assad, and then we'll have to see what happens to Idlib. Idlib is key here. If there's a massive attack, a major assault by the Syrian regime against Idlib, Turkey could face another massive wave of refugees, which means more pressure on Erdogan to try to do something about Syria. That's if he wins in the next elections.
What about Turkey's role in NATO after that?
You know, again, that really depends on relations with the United States. I have to say that despite some of the very challenging policies we see by the Erdogan government, for example, they've arrested Pastor Andrew Bronson. He's a U.S. pastor in Turkey. That has put a lot of pressure on relations between Turkey and the United States. And of course, there's the issue of Fethullah Gulen, also, which has put a lot of tensions, and add to that is the U.S. decision to move embassy to Jerusalem. However, what is interesting is that despite these differences, the Americans have just allowed the delivery of the F-35 fighter to Turkey. This is a huge win for Erdogan. And now the U.S. forces and the Turkish forces, or the per-Turkish forces, are now patrolling together in the Manbij area. We have to remember that this was a major point of contention in terms of relations between the United States and Turkey, and NATO and Turkey. So, you know, for now we see that even if Erdogan wins, despite the fact that Mr. Ince, who is the opposition, has said he's going to have a much more friendly approach towards the West, but I think even if Erdogan wins, I think we are seeing a temporary but important easing of relations between United States and Turkey, which I think will allow Erdogan to increase his leeway in terms of his relations with NATO. I don't think when it comes to relations with NATO, I don't think Mr. Erdogan is going anywhere.
Earlier, our studio guest, Ms. He Wenping, just said that Turkey's EU membership dream is long gone. And do you think that's the case for sure? And interestingly, EU and Turkey are now both facing U.S. tariffs. It's interesting, on Thursday, Turkey has announced tariffs worth $266.5 million against the U.S. tariff against the Turkish steel products. So do you think there's still connecting points putting the two sides together, at least facing one common enemy?
You know, in theory, I would agree with you, but I would have to say that the behavior of the Erdogan government in Europe over the last couple of years has really made the rapprochement with the Europeans difficult. We saw how relations with Germany worsened after the participation of some Turkish politicians in Germany, where it created a lot of controversy. In Holland, relations have sharpened greatly in terms of with Holland recently. Mr. Ince, who is again the head of the opposition, has called for much better relations with the EU. But I think that despite the fact that there are some common points, as you mentioned, between EU and Turkey, I think if Mr. Erdogan wins, there's not a lot of hope for improvement, as long as the lingering tensions exist between Turkey and Germany, which is Germany is a very important player in the EU, and of course Turkey and Holland. Let's not forget that there's some also dual German nationals, Turkish nationals that are in prison in Turkey, which has put even more pressure on the relations. And so I think this is one of the issues that is, I think that the lingering problems will remain if Mr. Erdogan is elected.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maya Javandanfa, a Middle East analyst based in Tel Aviv. So, Ms. He, very quickly, what do you think would be the single most challenging task for the president-elect of Turkey this time in diplomacy?
Well, still how to handle the relations like in Syria, because now the very first concern for him is how to make that military action in the Afrin area. Now now it's becoming, the momentum now for him. So, but the key is how to maintain them, make this safer zone becoming a very good area to separate those Kurdish in Syria and those Kurdish in Turkey.
Right. What about you, Mr. Hendrik?
Economics. Politics is always based on economics. Is there a chicken in every pot? And if there isn't, why not? I think this will continue as the world situation continues to deteriorate, as Turkey has problems and as its growth rate goes down. I think this is going to be the major issue.
Thank you very much for your input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Deng in Beijing. Bye-bye.